Hello, my name is Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution and the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. It's my great privilege to introduce you to Niall Ferguson, the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. In addition to his insightful commentary on world affairs, Niall Ferguson is also a distinguished author and historian. In fact, he is the chair of the Hoover Institution's History Working Group. In that capacity, he's drafted a working paper that we're going to discuss today. But first, Niall, I want you to talk a bit about the history group and what exactly it does. I think this is actually a tremendous thing you've done. It's very much in keeping in the tradition of what Mr. Hoover had in mind when he formed our institution, which was not only to study war, revolution, and peace, but also to bring scholars together to learn about the past, to better understand the present, and better anticipate the future.
And indeed to study revolutions, war and peace. And that's why the Hoover Institution sits right next to a large archive full of materials that are relevant to those subjects. The Hoover History Working Group is a new thing that only came into existence a matter of months ago. But it's sort of complementary to the Hoover Military History Working Group that my good friend Victor Davis Hanson set up some time ago. And it seemed to me that there really ought to be a kind of civilian history enterprise to complement it. We also, I think, in setting it up, had in mind a kind of policy-focused kind of history. I've even been known to use the term applied history. So we've tried to steer our seminars towards what might be called policy-relevant history. And we've had some excellent seminars since we got up and running on financial issues, for example, a terrific paper by Mike Bordeaux on globalization and historical perspective. But then along came COVID-19, and our seminars in the Hoover buildings had to be suspended. And like so much else in the world, we had to Zoom it. And we thought that given the circumstances, the smart thing would be to focus on what we can learn from the past about pandemics. And that's what this paper I've written is about.
Let's talk about the paper, Niall. The title is Black Swans, Dragon Kings, and Gray Rhinos, the World War of 1914 to 1918, and the Pandemic of 2020 to question mark. That question mark is very ominous, my friend. And I want you to explain what a black swan, a dragon king, and a gray rhino is. But first, let's talk about the premise of the paper and what inspired you to connect the problems of the present to the problems of over a century ago.
Well, the easy option for a historian confronted with a pandemic is just to look at other pandemics. And there actually have been a rash of papers, for example, looking at the 1918-19 influenza. The problem is it's very difficult to disentangle the 1918-19 influenza pandemic from World War I because it started before the war was over. And there really isn't an easy way to separate out the impacts. And in any case, I tried to argue in the paper that we shouldn't be too siloed in our thinking, that a really big disaster can take multiple forms. And there are special kinds of disaster that we historians find very interesting that have distinct properties that make them quite hard to predict and hard to anticipate and indeed hard to understand as they're happening. And in this broad category of very big and hard to predict disasters are wars, financial crises, earthquakes, and pandemics, all of which are governed by a curious statistical thing called a power law, which just means that they're not normally distributed like, say, human height or IQ. There's no bell curve for wars. There's no bell curve for pandemics. When you look at the samples, the kind of list of these events in history, it's very striking that there are some absolutely huge ones that just stand out a mile, and then lots and lots of really quite small ones. And so they aren't normally distributed. So what I wanted to suggest was that if you think of that broad set of really big unpredictable disasters, actually a pandemic like the one we're going through might have more in common with the outbreak of World War I than with, say, the Black Death of the 1340s. That was the organizing idea of the paper.
Right. And the commonalities, Niall, are that, first of all, there are plenty of warning signs that this was going to happen. Secondly, that when it did happen, the public was shocked that it happened when in fact they should have been braced for it. And then thirdly, just tremendous upheaval, economic, social, geopolitical.
And that brings us to my strange menagerie in the title, which I'd really better unpack. So the way you just introduced the concept is quite nice, actually, because a grey rhino is something you see coming. You've got lots of
Yes.
warning that it's coming towards you, and so you really ought not to be surprised. And both World War One and the COVID-19 pandemic were like that. I lost count of the number of people over the last 20 years who said we should really be worried about a big pandemic. And I really lost count of the number of books written before 1914 that said at some point Britain and Germany would probably go to war. And yet, despite this grey rhino trundling towards us, when the event actually arrives, we are shocked, stunned, astonished. This was completely unexpected. And that's the moment at which it becomes a black swan. A black swan is a term Nassim Taleb popularized, and it just means something that somehow you just didn't see coming at all, because your expectations, maybe because of the way our brains have evolved, maybe because of the way we're educated, your expectations are that everything is really normally distributed. Like your chance of having a car accident is just like your chance of having a world war or a pandemic. So despite the grey rhino, when it actually happens, it's a black swan, and we're totally and utterly amazed. And then finally, the Dragon King. So the Dragon King is something of such colossal size in its historical impact that it's sort of out with even the power law. It's beyond the power law. And I think when you look at an event like World War One, its historical impact is not really just because something like 10 million men lost their lives prematurely on battlefields. It's all the consequences that followed from the war that make it such a huge historical turning point. To name just one, the Bolshevik Revolution. And I might add that probably the Spanish influenza was one of those other second-order consequences of the war that had actually bigger impact than the war itself. It killed more people than the war, oddly enough, that pandemic. And I don't think it would have happened without the very strange circumstances of 1918, after 4 years of slaughter with armies crisscrossing the world. In a way, the world had been set up for disaster. People were weakened, exhausted, in many cases hungry, and the trenches of the battlefields and the army camps were actually the perfect place for a new influenza virus to take shape. So that's the way I think about this. An event can be simultaneously a grey rhino, utterly predictable, repeatedly predicted, and a black swan, totally and utterly amazing and surprising, and a Dragon King, massive in its ramifications.
Right. Now, you took this paper in one direction, Neil, that a lot of World War I documentaries do not. You talked about economic disruption, in particular, the effect on globalization. One doesn't normally associate globalization with the first early decades of the 20th century.
Yeah, globalization is not an invention of the late 20th century. In fact, the real first stage of globalization was the late 19th century and early 20th century, when every market for goods, for labor, for money, even for ideas became much more integrated than it had ever been before, partly because of technology. You know, steamships just became super efficient. It was suddenly very easy to cross the Atlantic or even the Pacific. And then the telegraph allowed communications to happen far more rapidly than had been possible before. So I don't think I'm saying anything controversial. In fact, it's really quite a familiar story now to historians when I say that the First World War ended the first stage of globalization and ended it very abruptly.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about the rise of socialism. Socialism today, neo-democratic socialism, strikes me as sort of salon socialism. It's very popular if you're elite, if you have a very, extravagant lifestyle, if you're a career politician. What was the difference between socialism today versus socialism back in the World War I era? Were there the likes of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn's?
Well, there were Sanders and Corbyn-like figures back then, but they were a good deal more doctrinaire, that is to say, much more committed to the teachings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and later Marxist theorists like Karl Kautsky. So I think if one goes back to the pre-1914 period, social democracy was really socialist, and it was committed to a broad range of policies that implied substantial diminution of the rights of private property and the imposition of considerable state controls over the economy. I don't think many of those socialist leaders in 1914 quite appreciated what was happening when the war broke out. It caught most of them unawares. But it turned out to be a fantastic opportunity for the most extreme Marxists, who were the Russian Bolsheviks, to make their revolution. And that, of course, was a real moment of truth, because when the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917 in the Russian Empire, they proceeded to implement the most radical version of Marxism that really has ever been, embarking on wholesale massacre of the capitalist class, followed somewhat later by the massacre of the so-called kulaks, the big peasants, which was Stalin's brainchild. So, yeah, by the standards of that time, today's self-styled democratic socialists are pretty weak beer.
Let's talk about the ruling classes, Neil. It's hard to find a more, quizzical group of characters than the likes of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in this age. But if we go back 106 years, Neil, you have Kaiser Wilhelm and George V. They're first cousins. George and Nicholas are first cousins as well. Wilhelm and Nicholas are third cousins. Why could not these three blood relatives figure out a way to get out of this war? How could they not stop the train from going down the tracks?
Yeah, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was an extraordinary family that had somehow managed to get various relatives on to almost every throne in Europe. But it turned out not to be enough to prevent conflict any more than it was possible for the Rothschilds, who had the world's first truly multinational bank in most of the European capitals. No, in the end, the decision makers turned out to be prime ministers, chancellors, generals, in particular the chiefs of general staffs, and the Kaiser and his relatives ultimately had to yield to the political and military advice, which was that you actually had to go for it in 1914, because any later military confrontation would only be less advantageous. More or less everybody kind of formed that view, and that was why ultimately all the great powers decided on war. But I think you make an important point, which is that it was a rather remarkable descent into conflict, considering how closely related all the royal houses of the great European empires were. It was just another reason why people were so taken aback by the very rapid way in which Europe went from an assassination in a little Ruritanian town called Sarajevo to the biggest war there had ever been. I think you've captured one of the reasons that people were surprised.
The final question, Neil, is this just a common thread that we see in the human existence, where we devote a lot of our intellect and imagination to worst case scenarios? There was a movie in 2016 called Pandemic. If you go on the TED Talk website, Neil, you'll find 61 different talks devoted to pandemic. Yet when push comes to shove and when the event strikes, we're gobsmacked. We don't know what to do. Is this something we see throughout history, or is this unique to now and unique to 1914, 1918?
Well, I think part of the point of doing a paper like this is to make the contrasts obvious as well as the similarities. If you take another really big disaster like World War II, that was anything but a surprise when it began. Indeed, many people thought it would begin in 1938, and it nearly did. But there's a very big contrast to be drawn there between something that is a black swan, or at least appears to be when it happens, and something that stays a grey rhino all the way until you're actually marching towards the front line. So I think not all disasters have the quality that 1914 and 2020 had. And I think we need to address a particular question, which there wasn't time to do in the paper. And that is why some of these big disasters are effectively anticipated and others are not. I don't think it was inevitable that we would be so completely gobsmacked by a pandemic, because not every country in the world was. Right. There were countries like Taiwan and South Korea that knew exactly what to do almost the minute they heard a rumor about something funny going on in Wuhan. So I don't think it's always the case that the grey rhinos turn into black swans at the moment of truth. I think sometimes actually we successfully anticipate disaster. And what makes history fascinating is that we now have to ask that next question. Okay, why are some of these grey rhino, black swan, dragon kings so much more disruptive than others? Why do we sometimes get it right and sometimes get it wrong? And that, I think, ultimately becomes a question of political history. It requires us to analyze why government departments that were notionally responsible for biodefense so utterly failed in the last 4 months, because ultimately that's the kind of question historians are going to be asking, if not this year, then maybe in a couple of years' time when we've got enough bandwidth to have a proper commission of inquiry.
Niall Ferguson, thank you for your time, and congratulations on the History Working Group. It is a smashing success, and on behalf of my colleagues, just keep doing the great work you do.
Thanks, Bill.
I am Bill Whalen, a Hoover Institution Research Fellow and the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism, and you've been listening to Niall Ferguson, the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow and the Chair of the Hoover Institution's History Working Group.